The social work profession was founded in social change. Throughout our profession's history, social workers have sought to ensure that all people have equal access to the resources and opportunities that allow them to meet their basic needs. Our code of ethics explicitly calls us to engage in social and political action that seeks to ensure that all people have equal access to the resources, employment, services, and opportunity that they require. Social workers should be aware of the political impact of the political arena and practice, and should advocate for changes in policy and legislation to improve social conditions and to meet basic human needs and promote social justice. Social workers have historically been amazing advocates for our clients and communities, but at times have forgotten to advocate for ourselves and our profession. This is changing every day. As we begin our program for today, we have an amazing panel who will share with you some of the recent, past, present, and future advocacy we can expect for social work in Michigan. And at the end of our hour together, I hope you will all leave feeling energized and have some specific action items to take forward to your networks today. So I have the privilege of bringing forward our three panelists today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. We'll start with Melina Brand. Melina.
Hi, everybody. I'm Melina Brand. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at NASW Michigan. And I apologize that I have a stuffy nose today, so I'm a little bit sick, but we're here.
Thanks, Melina. Dean Kubiak.
Good morning. This is Cheryl Kubiak. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Work at Wayne State University, and I use she, her pronouns.
And Noah Smith.
Hi, Noah Smith with Capital Services. I am NASW's multi-client or contract lobbyist here in Lansing. He, him pronouns.
Thank you all for being here and for your work that you've done with NASW and for the social work profession for some of you many years. Noah, first kind of question to you: what is a multi-client lobbyist, and what does that role look like different from Melina, who's an in-house lobbyist for NASW?
Sure, and a lot of organizations have both, and really it's the two kinds of lobbyists that you can be: the in-house lobbyist or corporate or association lobbyist, which is Melina, who has, and she'll go into this too, responsibilities not only at the Capitol for helping advance specifically NASW's mission in Lansing, or Washington D.C. if this were Washington, but at any rate here in Lansing. But she also has responsibilities to all of you, to the membership, and to developing a culture of advocacy within NASW. A multi-client lobbyist is a little different. We are like a law firm, sort of. We're sort of a firm where lots of different organizations put us on retainer to represent their various interests in and around the Capitol. And a lot of organizations, NASW obviously included, do both. And it's about sharing relationships. The magic of having a multi-client firm in partnership with an in-house lobbyist is that the breadth of clientele that a multi-client firm represents gives the lobbyist in a firm access to a broader array of lawmakers, where NASW certainly has lots of different issues in front of lots of different committees, from health policy to Department of Health and Human Services appropriations. Appropriations in Lansing speak is the committee that spends your tax money on programs and services. It's still a somewhat narrow focus where they tend to be in front of those types of committees and those lawmakers who focus more specifically on the things that social workers, and social work clientele cares most deeply about. We have clients, again, that have a broader array of things that put us in front of judiciary, tax policy, different appropriation subcommittees, oversight, agriculture, different committees and different lawmakers. And so we have a breadth of lawmakers that we have relationships with. And ultimately, the magic of lobbying, either for Melina or for those of us over Capital Services, is relationships, is cultivating relationships at the Capitol, because ultimately for lawmakers, and you just heard from Representative Felicia Braybeck, one of our closest and staunchest allies at the Capitol, very obviously. But it's about sharing those relationships and using those relationships, right? We've developed and cultivated that relationship with Representative Braybeck because human nature is. It's easier to do something for someone you know than it is for a complete stranger. And so we're sharing those relationships. But we also, Melina and I, discuss it as sharing power. That access to those relationships is a form in and of itself of power. And so what are we doing but sharing those relationships and sharing that power with NASW, with each other, and ultimately with all of you, to be able to move what it is that NASW wants to do through the Capitol. And so a multi-client firm is a source of strategy, is a source of relationships. We've been around and moved lots of different types of bills through the legislature so we can help advise. And again, just share those types of relationships that we have over a broad array of lawmakers.
No, I think that that's very helpful foundation for us to set today. And when we talk about advocacy work, it is all relationship building, right? And that's where social workers thrive, and being able to connect our stories or our clients' stories with folks who have different power. Sometimes it's power that's money, or to change who gets access to a service. And so I really appreciate the three of you for the work that you're doing in kind of expanding who has access and who are at the tables. Because many times social workers have not been at tables of where decisions are made, and we are actively trying to change that. But as we get into this morning, I want to talk a little bit about how the last few years has changed our outlook as a profession, and then also how has advocacy changed because of how the world has changed. So obviously we're currently still in a pandemic, and whatever iteration of this current version is, I'm wondering if the three of you could talk a little bit about how did the pandemic change the social work profession from your lens, and maybe Noah more specifically, how did the pandemic change the advocacy work and how kind of Lansing operates? I can throw this out to maybe Dean Kubiak first.
Thank you, Dwayne. I think, first of all, I want to acknowledge that COVID affected us individually as social workers, right? We can't not pay attention to the trauma of not only the pandemic, but the wars that we're currently experiencing, and that has an effect on us as individuals, and it depletes our energy. And so I think that knowing that that's a reality and that we have to take care of ourselves is the first thing. The second thing is that, with the Zoom, you talk about relationship building. I still think that the best way to build relationships is in that face-to-face moment where you have someone's undivided attention. I know I'm always guilty of multitasking on this Zoom. So to me, anytime you can build that relationship, right, face-to-face, it's really important to do that.
Yeah, I agree. Kind of building off that, I think in 2020, a lot of social workers had to shift to doing telehealth or utilizing, over computers or over the phones for our services. And that really affected reimbursements and policies and priorities within that realm of telemedicine. And that's still happening today. We have a few bills actually in the House right now talking about reimbursement for telehealth and having that parity and the same as being face-to-face. But I think a lot of it has had to impact our relationships and relationship building, especially within the clinical and therapy realm. I'll pass it off to Noah.
The pandemic was sort of wild at the Capitol because it changed. it sort of changed some of the outreach. Less people could come to the Capitol, it was odd. God, it's sort of hard to describe because I'm reaching back. It's only been 3 years, but wow, what a wild 3 years, right? So a lot changed, but a lot didn't change. I guess what I'm trying to say is there is an absolute necessity for face-to-face contact at the Capitol. And reading body language and reading nuance and being able to see in 3 dimensions what's going on around you. And the prevailing thought as your lawmakers come to the Capitol and vote that that they need to be present and to be seen voting, because you can't otherwise tell who might be off camera saying or doing something that might be influencing that vote. In other words, the Capitol, as odd as people think that it is, tried to find a way to bridge public access, but the need for that very honest face-to-face contact. I think the thing that has come from it that has been a benefit is that now more than ever, rather than having an obscure cable channel for people who don't have cable anymore to tune into the proceedings at the Capitol, the legislature, in terms of committees, allows now the public to not only stream committees, but also stream legislative session on any device that's capable of streaming, and to be able to provide testimony, which is important. That's how organizations and individuals interact with the legislature to render their opinions on pieces of legislation, is through the committee process. And so committees now use this video technology to allow people to testify on bills. And what that's done is it's actually helped broaden the debate from only people who could make it to Lansing to render their opinions on pieces of legislation to now anyone. You still have to follow some protocol and such. It's not the Wild West or anything like that. But now it's broadened who can participate in the debate on bills at the Capitol. And I think the prevailing wisdom around Lansing is that that's been to the benefit of the debate on pieces of legislation.
Yeah, no, I think when you talk about the technology advances that we all were kind of forced to shift into, pre-COVID, I would say a lot of clinicians were very hesitant to work in doing telehealth or any sort of technology integrated in practice. And we all had to kind of shift very quickly. Dean Kubiak, I'm curious from your perspective at the university level, having to shift school, social work curriculum to completely virtual. What sort of effect did that have? And maybe if you could talk about some of the pros and cons of how that shifted the student base at Wayne State.
Yeah, clearly post-pandemic, we've had more and more students want to do, asynchronous or virtual education. And while, we are trying to build systems that allow that, but also increase the engagement, right? You can't be off camera. You can't be detached as a social worker. You got to be in the mix. And so how do we do that? And I think that shifting that and keeping our social work values and ethics in play means that for educators, we got to do a little bit more work, and we got to do more outreach. We have to have more services to make sure that our social work students are getting kind of that incredible education that produces those social workers who can go out and advocate. And you can't do that by attending a class and watching the kids, or attending the class and doing the dishes. You've got to be engaged in the educational process. And I would say to the students who are on here, you too have to have the responsibility of taking up the resources and being engaged in activities or extracurricular things. But you're starting to build those relationships now that will benefit you and your career and your future advocacy. Every opportunity you have to build a relationship is going to be important to your careers.
Yes, I cannot scream that louder. One of the things I talk to new professionals and students about a lot is, how do you expand that social work network? I mean, we've chosen social as half of our title for our whole professional career. A lot of us as introverts, that can be a little bit like, okay, how am I going to recharge my energy? But how do we get connected to people within our own profession? And often we see that many of the times when you're seeing an ethical violation or practice issues, it's because folks are not connected. They're siloed off. They're not having mentorship. They're not having peer consultation. They're not having a good group of folks to connect with outside of maybe their little bubble at their organization. And many of our jobs are siloed. And during the pandemic, obviously, many of us were stuck at home by ourselves, and it made it really challenging to continue to build those networks, which makes me, Dean Kubiak, you mentioned energy depletion. This last weekend, I was lucky enough to be in Washington, D.C. for NASW Pioneer Reception, which recognizes social workers who've had wonderful legacies throughout their career. And the great grandson of W.E.B. Du Bois was there, talking about kind of the history of racial and social justice in America. And he talked a lot about the dualities that we live in 2023, where you have a state like Michigan who was able to expand civil rights. We're expanding voting rights. We banned conversion therapy. But at the same time, we're living in a country that you've got states that have passing bans on gender affirming care, on drag performances, on books, right? And that really is hard to live with and grapple with every day as a citizen of this country and as a profession that's working towards social justice, and as a field that we are more and more connected, not just within our little network here in Michigan, but across the country and across the world. I'm wondering if maybe each of you could talk just a little bit about how you keep your energy up in these challenging times, and what advice you would give to kind of our next generation of social workers to make sure that they're focusing on their wellness while still doing the work of social justice.
Okay. Well, I can just say that I think that for me, it's knowing what kind of my lane is and what I can do. So all of us in social work are there and are passionate about different issues, right? Mine is around criminal legal reform and how the behavioral health intersection is there. And so to me, it's like, I know that that's where I'm putting most of my energy. I cannot like multitask a lot of different issues because I realize that my energy will be depleted and I can't move in the arena that I'm best able to. So I would say like find your passion and like focus, 80% of their energy there. It doesn't mean you ignore any, but you can have different roles on different issues. You don't have to be, you can be a lead on one or a prime advocate on one and maybe a supporter on others. So that's one of the ways that I kind of manage my energy and my involvement.
Yeah, I agree with what Dean Kubiak just said, but I also, when I have interns, I tell them to prioritize your self-care outside of work because that's where you will get re-energized. And I'm a big proponent of leaving work at work most of the time. It's harder in this job, as no one knows. But having those hobbies and being able to disconnect from thinking about work all the time is one of the main ways that I keep my energy up.
And Noah, our multi-lobbyist, it can't take probably either of those advice, right? Options.
Yeah, we're horrible at self-care. Lobbyists are terrible at self-care. Don't take any of my advice because it's not very good advice on self-care.
Also, probably why we need more social workers working with lobbyists. Or
yes, please. Right? Yes. So yes, please. We could use it. But there is a legislative cycle to things, right? And there are sometimes when the legislature is not in town, and the lobby corps as a group of professionals tends to disappear at about the same time because take that vacation. When you got the vacation time, take the vacation time. If you can take the time off, take the time off. You got to be able to recharge your batteries. Like even a type A extrovert, like most of us are in this profession, we can even hit our limit of people. And so, go escape into the woods, go heal amongst the trees when you get that chance.
Yes, I'll reiterate that. Take your vacation time. Well, thank you for that. I really do want to just, for our folks listening in today, it's a weird time to be on Earth. There's a lot of really large issues that we're tackling all at once and that are coming at us 24/7. And it is really hard to turn off the news, turn off the phone, turn off the media. And sometimes that's about self-care. Sometimes it's going to be taking that vacation, going to sleep early. Sometimes it's going to be advocating for yourself at the Capitol, and that's going to be your self-care, right? Sometimes it's going to be, that's what's going to recharge you, is to see that bill pass that you've been wanting to see for the last 10 years. And that talks a little bit about, states are very different legislatively, and sometimes they change pretty drastically in one election. And that's what we saw here in Michigan in November. We have had the Democratic Party take over all three chambers of the legislature in one election cycle, and for the first time in 40 years. And that changes what the priorities are, who the power players are, what can get passed and what cannot get passed. And so it's also changing kind of, as Noah mentioned earlier, the relationships that you have to build are going to be a little bit differently than before. It may even be the same people, but they may have a slightly different role now that they're in, the dominant party. And so I'm curious if we could just talk briefly about how did this legislative shift in the last year transform what we're seeing policy-wise? And Noah, maybe you could, and Melina could talk specifically about some of the bigger pieces of legislation that we've seen passed this year that have been maybe on hold for a long time that align with kind of NASW's agenda. And we can start there.
Yeah. Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, do you want me to start or do you want to go ahead, Melina? Do you want to kind of set the stage? All right, that's fine. So I was actually just jotting down some notes, Dwayne, while you were thinking, because there were some words, some phrases I wanted to try to remember as we kind of talk about this. Because sometimes at the Capitol, especially when you see things in the news, right? A bill is introduced on this day and it rockets through the legislature and the governor signs it in 25 minutes. And so because Felicia Brabeck has now and Kim Edwards have dropped our two bill package on licensure, well, then that means we're going to pass that bill next week, right? Well, I wish. and what actually happens at the Capitol is, in our own lexicon, incrementalism is sort of the operable phrase here in the Republic. Incrementalism is sort of how things move. Is that your idea starts? I have to keep my hands in camera. So your idea starts. Geez, you can't get in the camera. Your idea starts this big, and it gets this big, and then it gets this big, and then it gets this big, and then pretty soon it's only that big, even though your idea started that big, right? And that's sort of how things operate. The shift in the legislature that led to some very important priorities for Democrats, who have, as was mentioned a minute ago, a trifecta here in Lansing, has actually been years in the making. It was 30 years of patience and working politics and working issues in communities to finally get communities to shift a political mindset. And at the Capitol, a lot of the bills that seemed like they got introduced and rocketed through in a month or 2 months, A, there were very heavy lifts behind the scenes, but B, those are things that have been written and waiting in the wings and waiting for the right political climate for a long time. And a lot of work over the past 10, 12, 14, 20 years, getting lawmakers used to hearing certain phrases, getting a political mindset ready to go so that when a political opportunity opened up, it could move very quickly. So even though things rocketed, every step along the way was a very incremental step that was years in the making. The normal legislative life cycle, one of my fellow business partners and I joke about it all the time. It's like sort of a 3 to 4 year cycle where in your first year, it's what is this and why are we doing this? And then the second year is, didn't we already do this? And then the third time around, it's, well, let's get this done, right? But that's the mindset around the Capitol, right? And that's sometimes how long it takes. So it doesn't feel like it when you see that stuff in the news about how quickly things are moving. What I can say on the opposite end is it's actually not as quick as it looks. And it requires a lot of work, not just magical lobbyists sprinkling magical lobbyist dust behind the scenes. Very not much what happens. It's actually a partnership between lobbyists and organizations that have people in the communities, getting their lawmakers used to hearing things and exercising your First Amendment right to engage with your lawmakers and say things and push things at the Capitol. It's a true partnership that changes politics at the top level, where you throw the bums out, right? Get rid of the first party and move in the next party because the old party just wasn't responsive to what you wanted, and how you then move your priorities to the Capitol. Did that hit it, Melina?
Yeah.
Okay.
Building off that, it was kind of weird. The shift from my side was, before the trifecta, we were always on defense. providing testimony and providing opposition. And now we are, thinking of bills to introduce, like our licensure stuff, and being supportive and passing other bills like the conversion therapy ban that we testified and passed earlier this year. When I first started, we were clawing at, like, please stop doing all of these things and begging to stop doing these. And now, earlier this year, it was like, oh, we can do all of these types of things. But, as Noah mentioned, the process is pretty slow and we got some stuff done, but we're still working on some other stuff. And they'll be on break soon, so it'll just start all over again.
Dwayne, if I can add, I was at the Safe and Just Michigan dinner last night, one of Noah's other clients, and was able to talk with Senator Chang, who another big ally for us, right? And the juvenile justice reform legislation was passed by both House and Senate, which is wonderful, right? But I also heard a lot about, with this shift comes a little bit more caution with the Democrats, right? And so some of the things on the criminal legal reform side that we thought would be easy to get through are struggling a bit. And so I think there's two sides here, but we're in a political environment, right? And the Dems want to keep that. And so there's a bit more caution sometimes around things that I thought we'd like, yeah, let's go. So just to add that.
Well, and I think regardless of the political climate or which party's in control, as social workers, we have to be working in those environments regardless, right? And how do you build relationships with folks who you may not agree with 100% of the time, maybe even 99.9% of the time. And that can be really challenging when you may, for instance, in Missouri, I was talking with our executive director there, the same day that they were able to pass their compact language, their governor signed an anti-trans gender affirming care bill, right? And so like this duality where you may have some good connection and able to make some relationships in one area, and how to not burn the bridge when you have disagreements. And that's really challenging sometimes, especially with how hot politics are these days. And it feels very inflammatory. And I think a lot of folks want to feel right one way or the other. And when you're in the space, you have to be able to negotiate. And like you said, Noah, this incremental change where you may have the dream thing, but to get to the dream, you have to slowly get there, right? And I think one prime example of that is last year when we passed the SMART bills. That was in a Republican-led bipartisan committee, right, that had bipartisan support. And that was our first paid internship specifically for school social workers. And that was able to move the needle, right? And then we were able to get Felicia Brayback $5 million into the state budget this year. And then hopefully in the beginning of next year, we'll have Rep. Edwards' bill for more paid student internships. So, this incremental stuff, this is where you can see it happening almost in real time for social work in Michigan around paid internships, which is really exciting. And that is very different than even 5 years ago. The conversation nationally was not happening around this, and you weren't seeing legislative movement really on this area. And so this is also where students have real power in helping change the narrative. And I will say there's been such great student advocacy in Michigan, but also nationally around paid internships. And by able to keep that momentum going, it's able to change minds. It's be able to share the reality and the lived experiences of folks who've gone through social work programs, who we know how expensive it is to go to school these days, and going into a field where you may have to wait the 10 years to get your loans forgiven if you even qualify, right? And how challenging that narrative is. So I want to, that I think is a really good foundation to talk about, like, what's happening now in social work. So I'm wondering, from your all's lenses, what are some of the most common challenges you're hearing about as it relates to the social work workforce? And I'm going to start with Dean Kubiak on this one, because I know that there's a lot as it specifically relates to students as well.
Yeah. I think it's a wonderful time to be a social worker, right? In terms of the need, when you talk about supply and demand. And, as we saw with those statistics, the Southeast Michigan, 30% vacancy rates in social work positions. And in fact, again, working in the UP, we got some money for diversion, and we were trying to do diversion activities, but couldn't hire a social worker. We had a position up for 2 years. And so we stand the risk to lose some of those gains, particularly around diversion from the criminal legal system, if there isn't a service continuum or a treatment continuum that's accessible, right? Law enforcement is going to take folks to jail if they can't get them into the treatment center. So I think the workforce issues are critical to our thriving social change agenda. And I obviously think that we saw some, universities around the state saw dips in enrollment during COVID, especially in our master's programs. But it's been very exciting, especially on the bachelor's level. We're seeing increases. So we know that this is something that people are feeling called to again, that social change agenda. But how do we get them in? How do we make this a great return on investment for students? And how do we change the attitude as social work as a communal good instead of putting the burden on the individual, right? If social workers are providing goods to our community, then where's the support for those social workers so that they don't have so many student loans that they're on food stamps in their first job? So I can just say that here at Wayne, we've been applying for every federal training program that we can. Luckily, we just got 3 of them, and that allows us to pay sometimes pretty lucrative stipends to social workers. The other thing is we finally pushed the Title IV-E through, it looks like, with HHS, and so that we're going to start those pilot programs in many of the schools that will also give students stipends for working in child welfare. I think that this idea of paid placements is something that I really want to endorse and move forward. But I want to say that we have to be creative about those solutions. We can't just say to the universities, pay us. And we can't just say to the organizations, pay us. Bigger organizations like hospitals that may be in the for-profit game should pay and should be there that can support those internships. Don't tell the hospital association I said that right now, but I'm just, But what about those mom and pop organizations that are in the community that are struggling, right? They can't necessarily afford, they're using student labor to try to grow their organization. So how do we treat them differently? How do we support students in both of those kind of sectors? So I think the advocacy has to come with like Medicaid reimbursement rates. What I hear from social work organizations in the community is when I say, if you're billing for student time, why can't you pay the students? And they say, because we're just trying to offset the low reimbursement rates with student labor. So if we increase those Medicaid reimbursement rates, then could students have a piece of that pie? So I think we have to be very innovative. I'll just say one innovation that I think is worthwhile. We're looking at where's the workforce that we could support. And we all know that peer recovery coaches, peer support specialists are proliferating in the community. They're really valued in that. But what's their career trajectory and how can we support them? So we've been working with organizations here in Southeast Michigan to say, look, if somebody comes back to school, will you continue them on your payroll 5 days a week? And then 2 days a week, you put them in a different side of your organization so that people aren't having to do their 40 hours and 16 hours of internship, and they're still collecting a paycheck. So that's one example of how can we be innovative as universities to help students get to that higher ed where we're increasing our workforce and increasing their career goals.
Yeah,
if I could, sure. So I think Cheryl is spot on with that, and thinking about some things that Melina said too a few minutes ago. So if anyone who's in this conference right now is my age or older, you're going to remember a guy named Tip O'Neill, and he was the Democratic Speaker of the House, and he had a quote and a book that was the same title, and it was "All Politics is Local." And that quote, and that's coming from a guy in Washington, D.C., and we love to sort of hang the yoke of folks in D.C. as never remembering, hi kitty cat, of never remembering anything locally because they're just tied up in the halls of power that's Washington, D.C. But Tip O'Neill was absolutely right. All politics is local. And so, like, I don't want to paint one party as overarchingly heroic and another party as terrifyingly evil all the time, but I think where we had been able to make strides when the political party that tends to be more aligned with what social work wants was not quite yet in power, we were still able to make great strides forward because we were able to show local need. These guys all are responding to their local communities. They know that there's a substance use crisis in their community. Greg Markkinen, Representative Markkinen from the UP, knows that he's got like 7 social workers up there, 1 psychologist, and a massive, substance use crisis. And he's trying to figure out what we got to do about that stuff, right? Kurt Vanderwall, from up here, representative, who helped us pass the SMART bill, was responding in part to the fact that he's got like no school social workers, way overworked, ratios of 1 to 750 in his largely, rural school district. So getting them to see these local workforce pressures and these local like human pressures are how NASW has always traditionally been able to move many of the things that are important to social work, social workers, and social work clientele, is by tying it for all of these lawmakers back to stark local need, the needs of their community, and then defining for them how it is that social work uniquely helps them meet those needs that they see in their very own communities. And that's how we've been able to make those incremental changes that we've been able to make over time. And so as we sort of launch into what we've got to do for licensure, that's going to be part of what's going to help yank that over, in the next several months. The finish line is showing that this is a workforce issue, that this is going to help satisfy a need, that we need to make modifications to our license and modernize our license structure so that we can help infuse more social workers into our local communities.
No, I think you're both right on. And when we talk about how do we recruit the next generation of social workers into the field, it is all of those things. It's reimbursement rates. It's making higher ed more affordable. It's making sure that when folks enter the field that their salaries and their jobs are going to be equip them to stay long term. We don't want social workers in positions where they're going to be regular turnover and burnout. That's not sustainable as a profession, right? And so how do we think about that at the policy side? And that policy also, I think, imparts at the organizational level. How do we get organizations to be thinking, how are we supporting our staff and what internal policies can we do to make sure that we're a workforce that's going to be thriving and keeping people here? The other conversation that I've been having, so the state is working, the Labor and Economic Opportunities Office, LEO, is piloting a program, hopefully to be launched next year, to start recruiting people at a younger or an earlier age to go into social work and other mental health and behavioral health professions, which I think is a really great thing. We haven't done a wonderful job of introducing folks earlier on in their career search into a field of behavioral health. I think a lot of us come into this field because of somebody we know or an experience within our own family and friends system that maybe we intersected with a social worker at some way, where the trades, often you have spaces throughout someone's educational career in K through 12 where they're getting exposure to that. And I'm very excited that the state has chosen social work as the first field in the behavioral health field to target, and going into high schools, providing toolkits and resources available to start educating younger folks about what a career could look like. And then I think all of our role here is making sure that those careers are valuable and long-term. And then as it relates to that, I think my question is, how do we make sure we're getting people into the right areas of social work as we think about the future of where the needs are going to be in the next 20, 30 years. And specifically, you know, this weekend when I was in DC, one of the conversations really turned to, you know, this idea of an aging tsunami that's coming, and that we don't have the workforce. And you know, if we go into a social work class and it's of 25 or 30 students, there may be 1 or 2 students who are interested in working with older adults. And, you know, I think that that's probably the average we're seeing. And that's not enough to meet the need of what we know is coming, right? And so I'm wondering if there are any specific things that you're seeing, Dean Kubiak or Melina, on the policy side about how we can tailor the market for where we know the jobs and the money is going to be.
Mhm. Well, I see, like, first of all, I want to just say that, like, policy, like, social workers are so good at policy, and yet, you know, the majority of our students are in interpersonal practice, which is wonderful, but we have to marry. This isn't 2 sides of social work or 2 different streams. We have to marry kind of the IP with the macro every time and every day, because those policies are affecting individuals. And I would love to see more social workers kind of invest in their policy skills and enforcing those no matter what area they go into. But of course, areas, you know, you're saying aging, substance use, obviously Noah talked about. We all know that there's this opioid use pandemic, the fentanyl. Um, that's a big area. Crisis, right? We know that the George Floyd unfortunate incident that occurred has kind of changed the dialogue and the discourse about first responders, and nationally we're seeing the shift from first responders being mental health professionals than first responders being law enforcement, and law enforcement being called in when there's a physical danger or physical crisis. But this isn't necessarily how we've trained social workers, right, to be first responders. So we're working with DHHS right now to create that training program, but I think that's a very keen area. I also think climate change, environmental justice issues, right? We saw in Detroit with the floods that occurred in 21 and 22 that many of the poorest citizens in our community were held hostage because of water, because of furnaces out, you know, and we worked with FEMA to go out and do that kind of crisis response to those individual homes, help them get past their denials. But I think those are the things that we have to be looking forward to the future about. How do we modify social work education to be moving into these fields more than kind of some of the more traditional. And it's not to say we don't need child welfare workers and we don't need, but child welfare workers are going to need how to respond in a crisis and mobile and youth crisis units in climate disasters. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you just said, Dean Kubiak. And Dwayne, going back to the aging sector, I think that's where people in my position come in, because a lot of aging services and long-term care rely on Medicaid, Medicare reimbursements and funding. And so from the policy side, we should be investing in our aging population as well, which in turn will increase salaries and all that stuff for social workers working in that sector too. As someone who has previously worked in hospice, I know that it was a hard sector to work in, but the people that I worked with, and I think increasing my salary would have helped me stay in that sector for a long time. And so I think we need to kind of take a two-pronged approach to it too, because so much of social work relies on funding from the government and grants and stuff like that. So we have to focus on appropriations as well as changing those reimbursement rate billing widgets too.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about the policy side and targeting specific sectors, I mean, that's where like the paid internship bills can also be relevant, and where we've tried, there was a huge need in schools. So that is an area that there was bipartisan support. Everyone kind of get behind kids' mental health, right? And so, we've been able to use that kind of model and replicate it into different sectors. I do think that there's probably other areas that we'll need to focus on. And as a profession, how are we continually talking about what the next thing is going to be? And so we're not behind the curve and not afraid to integrate technology into our work too. And we've got a session today about AI and social work. And I think that there's some really good and fascinating areas where AI is being intersected with social work, but also we have to work through the ethical and legal challenges that may bring as it becomes more prominent. So, Melina, I want to switch a little bit into our licensing as it relates to workforce challenges, and why do we even have licensing up for a conversation and legislative changes? And I think this would be a great time to maybe get from the dean's perspective some of the conversations that have been happening in the school circles around this. And so, Melina, will you just set the foundation? Why are we here, and where are we?
Yeah. So I think most of us are aware that last year the ASW-MI released 10 years of data on test results with demographics, which we have been asking for years and years. And it showed that there is like significant bias racially and within age groups of people who could pass the test. So that opened us up at NASW to kind of have this conversation with our larger social work community of, why is this test like this? What can we do to kind of make the field more equitable in our licensing process? And through a lot of town halls and meetings with deans and directors across the state and other organizations, we kind of figured that it's time to change our licensing laws, since we haven't changed them since 2005 when we first got licensing. And so then we went into, how can we change this? And a lot of it in our current legislation is changing our licensure structure levels to match what is happening across the nation, switching it to licensed bachelor social work, licensed master social work, and then our licensed clinical social work. And then recently we have been debating on if we should remove the examination altogether or on different levels. And so I don't know if Representative Braybeck mentioned this when she was on earlier, but we have included removing the examination requirement in the current bills that are happening. And so I forgot the question. I just kept talking, but I think it's important in this time, especially when as social workers, we really dig in on equity and equality for ourselves and communities, that we really look into our profession and our processes to make sure they are equitable as well.
Yeah. And I will just add, because I also happen to co-chair the National Association of Deans and Directors licensing task force. And this is obviously front and center for us, because our students who graduate from accredited programs and do supervised postgraduate time in workforce deserve to be licensed. And I think that we as a national organization have kind of three goals. One is to mitigate the harm that the exam has caused. So, is there a one-time test fee versus somebody paying 23 times for the exam? Can you just take the sections that you didn't pass instead of having to take the whole exam again? Things like that we've been trying to work with ASW-MI on. The second thing is what are the alternative pathways to licensure, such as Michigan is going to be a prime example and a test case. Because each school has to be accredited by CSWE, and we have to measure students, and we have to measure classes, and we have to measure program successes. And post-graduation, there's these requirements. Do we need an exam? Is an exam the best way to demonstrate efficacy as a social worker? Is it the best way to say the public is safe from charlatan practitioners? I don't happen to believe so. But I do know there's a strong sentiment about the exam and that parity with other professions. And are we going to minimize our kind of credentials if we don't have an exam. And that means we have to also look at, is there a different exam that may be more equitable that we can develop? And I say develop because that's not a quick fix. As someone who was trained psychometrically to do psychological testing, that's a 5-year proposition at best. So if we're going to move to a different type of exam, which my personal opinion is, I don't think that we need, but if that's kind of the way the profession is feeling and the national tenor on this, then we have to develop something differently. But for right now, I think we have a saying at the NAD group that we're fighting, I think, for the soul of our profession because of this issue around equity and fairness, and not to mention how this has affected the workforce shortages, have affected the communities that need social workers the most. I think we have to do this, and I think we have to be a front runner, and we are with the legislation that Rep. Brabeck is introducing. We are going to be among the most innovative of states in the nation. So I really think it's important. I also want to say one other point that kind of brings this legislatively back is that we know it's not a quick fix, that it's a 50-state solution because licensure and for social work is ingrained in rules and regulations or legislation. Each state will have a different solution. So we're creating a national toolkit that different states might have different avenues to change. So it's not going to be a quick fix, but I really applaud Dwayne, Melina, Noah, Rep. Brabeck for the really courageous work that they've been doing on this front, and look forward to supporting it.
Well, and Dean Kubiak, I think you're right on. I mean, when we look at the 50-state landscape for licensing, it's different in every state, right? There are some states that only have a clinical license and no other level. There are states that don't have a bachelor's license. There are states that have macro licenses, very few of them. Michigan's one of them right now that has a macro license. The process is different in different states. And then even when we look at our health professions here in Michigan, it's been very interesting the more we've dived into what do the counselors require versus the social workers versus the psychologists. You know, the counselors in Michigan don't have any continuing education that's tied to their licensing ever. You know, we're not talking about getting rid of that piece of our licensing process. You know, the psychologists have half the number of supervised requirements in social work. And Michigan is a slightly different state in terms of we were the last state to get licensed to begin with. So about a third of our current workforce never took an exam and were grandparented into the licensing law in 2005. So many of the folks at our organizations that are leading, that are doing supervision work, never took an examination. And we don't view them as less qualified. And there was a movement for a long time. If this is just what you do to be a licensed professional, is you add this examination in there. But I think it's a data-driven field. Now that we have data, it's going to did two things. A, it forced us to really know and then take action on our current profession. But I think it's going to force some other fields to probably open up their data around their own licensing process. And we're seeing this modeled at university levels. There's a lot of schools that have moved away from ACT and SAT requirements as a measure to get into schools. The teachers eliminated one of their exam requirements earlier this year in the Michigan. We're seeing this in nursing. So it's not unique to social work or to Michigan. And I think that that's some of the narrative that we're going to have to push back on. It's going to feel strange, right? But really, it's not. And from my lens as ethical, you know, if we have this one measure that's having a 40% different in terms of bringing people, specifically folks of color, into our field, that's a racial justice issue. It's a social justice issue. It's an economic justice issue. It impacts who can get promotions, who can stay on for in jobs. And so there's a few pieces of this. It's not just the exam. It's just not the tiers. There's a, you know, and I highly recommend for folks, what we're going to have lots of information out like in the next couple of days around how to go forward and help move this conversation. Because like Noah said, you know, this is going to be a process still. It's been over a year, but I will say these conversations have been happening for decades. It's not like this is a brand new discussion. I've been with NASW for 11 years, and I will say the exam has come up as an issue the entire time. The reason we have, or the why we have 6 renewal caps on limited license has been an issue the entire time we've had licensing. And so we know that we've got to listen to our folks on the ground. And if we're not listening to our social workers, especially those who are being left out or taken out of the field and not because of unethical reasons, we've got to find solutions for that. And so talking about next steps, Melina, what are we going to be asking people to do? And maybe Noah, if you could talk through what we may envision for a rough timeline.
Yeah, we will have a few action steps. I wanted them ready today, but we just got the bill numbers right before I came on, and I could not scramble to get everything ready. But we will have asked for reaching out to the Behavioral Health Subcommittee and urging them to support this, submitting written testimony to me so we can submit that to the committee as well. And then we have a few sign-on letters that we want people to sign on to. So we'll have an individual one where students and individual social workers can sign on, and we have an organizational letter too. So if you are a lead at an organization and you think that your org supports this, we'll have you sign on to that as well. And you know, that's going to be it for this year, I suppose. Noah can speak more to the timeline on that, but keep an eye out for emails and social media from us, because there will be a lot of action steps that we will have. And not all of them will be directly speaking to legislators. So, you know, talk to your field supervisors, talk to other people in the field as well, and get their opinions on this and start building up that groundwork and that the movement towards changing this.
Yeah, timelines are hard, right? Because then the moment a lobbyist says this is going to happen here and that's going to happen there, then, you know, I'm going to speak something into existence that may not be. So, you know, take everything that I say now with a grain of salt and keep in mind that it's probably going to be flexible and change tomorrow. So, you know, just bear that in mind. You know, typically when you have an effort like this that is sort of from a legislative standpoint, a radical change. From our standpoint, it's not a radical change, but from, you know, think about how the administration is going to view something like this, that parts of what we're asking for are frankly fairly simple and, you know, not that big a deal. And some of what we're asking for is getting at the heart of administrative regulation. So it's a radical change from that point of view. I think what we could see in the next few weeks here is Representative Braybeck, who chairs the Behavioral Health Subcommittee of the Health Policy Committee in the House, is probably going to have an introductory committee hearing where, you know, she will sit down with us and some other folks and just sort of kick off the concept. Hey, folks, here's this thing. It's going to take a lot of discussion. Here's why it's important. Here's why we're changing the national landscape. You know, here's what Michigan is doing for leadership, and let's just get used to talking about this. And that's kind of what Braybeck's approach is going to be. The legislature is going to have a sort of weird winter this year. There's remember that there's really only a 2-seat majority in both the House and the Senate, but effectively that's a 1-seat majority. You're going to really only lose 1 vote before you don't have the votes. In the Senate, that's not quite the same. The lieutenant governor can cast tie-breaking votes, but I'm starting to get into the weeds and away from my point. My apologies. But all that to say that we have a couple folks in the House and the majority side who also happen to right now be running for mayor of their local communities. If one or both of them win, that effectively shrinks the majority to nothing. It shrinks the majority to a tie if both of them win, or shrinks the majority to a 1 seat, which is effectively a no-seat majority if only one of the two of them wins. And so that's going to make November and December very unpredictable. There will either not be a November into December, or there will be a truncated November or December, or to be a special session November and December. So it's hard to say what the fall is going to be like legislatively. So I don't want NASW and our allies in this endeavor to think that now that we've got the bill introduced and Felicia Braybeck gives us a hearing, that, you know, in 25 seconds we're going to have this on the governor's desk. There's just some timeline and realistic hurdles that are in our way. But that doesn't mean we can't do anything. That means that we can take the winter especially when lawmakers go back home for the winter like they normally do before they come back in mid-January again. They're going to be home. And so that's a prime time for us to start that sort of groundswell that we talked about earlier, that, all politics is local. Now's the time to start getting lawmakers to think about, workforce shortages and behavioral health in their own communities, and what that means in their own communities, and how this is a solution among many solutions that's going to help alleviate whatever pressure it is that they're feeling, be it school social workers, be it clinical social workers. Well, everyone's a clinical social worker, but you get my point, sort of separating the two. Community health based, hospital based, so on and so forth. What are the various crises in their communities that social workers can be a part of? So I think we want to be able to take the fall to start that groundswell of information, and getting, words, reaching out to your own members to build local coalitions, reaching out to your lawmakers to start this topic, so that when the legislature returns in January and February, and has a nice long year throughout the year next year, that we've got a coalition built, that they've been hearing about this in their districts, that this is not a mystery to them when we start pushing around the halls of Lansing.
Yeah, no, and I think what we know about social workers in Michigan is we are the only health field that has at least one licensed professional in every county. Right. So there is no district that there's not at least one social worker. So we have all the fields, can make sure we're communicating with our reps and senators about this. And that's a great point. We've got an election in like a couple of weeks. It's not the one that gets all of the attention. So I'm just going to drop into the chat for everybody too. The link, if you're not registered to vote, or if you need to update your voter registration, please do so. We need every social worker out there empowering not just ourselves, but our circles, our clients, to use their voice in ways because like we've mentioned, if we're going to move stuff forward, we also have to have the right people in office. And that was part of the reason it took Michigan so long to get licensure to begin with, is we had not the right people elected that were supporting licensing at the time. And our whole hope with these particular efforts is to get more social workers into the field, more licensed practitioners, and to ease unnecessary burdens. I think that there's going to be a lot of misinformation that we're already hearing a little bit of floating out there. But the goal is more licensed social workers and more ethical practitioners. And there's definitely some good comments into the chat around how do we make people more ethical. And part of that is looking at our supervision standards, making sure that we have better organizational policies that are supporting workers when they're there. Are you getting the mentoring? Are you getting the training needs met once you are starting in your organization? So we've only got a couple of minutes left. So I want to give each of you maybe one last opportunity to just talk about what is your hope and what do you think our audience members can do going forward in the next few months? What would you like to see? And I'll start with maybe Dean Kubiak on this one.
Okay. So I'll say that in terms of the universities, all of the deans and the directors of the master's programs in the state of Michigan have already signed a letter in support of this legislation, and that we've been meeting monthly. We've been organizing our schools, government relations folks, and our students. The students and our student orgs are instrumental. Your voices and the collective action of within schools and across schools of students will be particularly helpful. And I think talking about this with your field practicum sites, like, make it a conversation, talk to people, because we know that probably a lot of the opposition is going to be within the profession because of misinformation. But educate yourselves and start the dialogue.
Great advice. Noah, what do you think from your angle?
Sorry,
should people be doing?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Yep. I think I sort of touched on it before, right? Like, now is the time to start connecting lawmakers to pressures in their districts that can be alleviated by social work, the Swiss Army knife, if you will, of the behavioral health sector, and present them with ideas and solutions, that we have on the table about how social work and social workers can help alleviate some of those pressures. Always, all politics is local, keeping your lawmakers apprised and aware of how you are a part of the solution to things that they see are hurting back home.
Thank you. And Melina.
Yeah, sorry, my cat Crouton wants to be a part of this.
We love
panel.
Crouton.
But yeah, I agree with all those. And as I mentioned, we will have action items on our Legislative Action Center that are specific to, reaching out to your representatives and people on this committee. And we'll have specific language that you can use, whether it's a phone call, in person, or writing an email. So, I'm trying to do everything to make this as easy and simple of a process for our social workers to be able to reach out to these people. And again, keep talking to your mentors, your organizations, and just stay in touch with us, because we'll tell you all you need to know. That's what's happening. And again, it's going to be a long process. So please don't think that we're ignoring you or nothing's happening. It's just the way that the legislature works.
Yeah, and I would just add, as we close out, NASW, we have a Legislative Social Policy Committee that meets the third Friday of every month from 12 to 1. And that is open to any social worker. And that's really where we hear from our members about what legislative issues are important to you all. We didn't touch on a whole lot of things in this hour. I mean, there's so much that we care about as a field and that we're working on that we can't just fit into this short block of time. But we know that you have lots of passion areas that we need to hear from you all for, and we need your leadership on. We're a staff of 7 at NASW Michigan. I think a lot of folks think we're like hundreds of people. No, there's 7 of us. And you've got 2 of us on this call, plus our lobbyist, Noah. And so we're doing our best with what we have as a staff, but we need your voice and your advocacy and your expertise at the table, because we're not experts at everything either. And so if you've got a passion area, if you are interested in something, if you're working on a coalition already, if you want to get appointed to a state board or commission, if you're running for office, we want to find ways to support social workers and elevate the work that you all are doing in the field. So I just want to thank you, Melina, Dean Kubiak, and Noah, for being with us this morning, for kicking our lead off this year.